Batu, Verona, Nikto.
You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
My God, it's full of stars.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space, the sci-fi movie review podcast. I'm Scott Weatherly, one of your hosts, and I'm joined by Julian. Julian, how are you doing?
I am nursing a cold, so if I cough every 5 seconds during this, well, that's just the way it's got to be. How are you doing, Scott?
I'm not too bad. So you haven't been using any teleportation devices and caught something from a new science?
Not that I know, but I have to say I was feeling this way as I was watching the film. Bad idea. Like, if you're feeling nauseous already and you have like a head cold and you're already dizzy and you're just watching like fingernails being peeled off and close up, bodies disintegrating, ears falling off, probably not the best idea.
Yeah, I think it's not one to watch while you're having your dinner, which was is definitely a mistake.
Well,
if you haven't already-
unless you regurgitate on your food. I mean, in which case,
true.
it's okay.
It's perfect. As they try in this film, it's an educational vignette for children. That's something to consider. If you haven't already guessed, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be covering 1986's The Fly, directed by David Cronenberg. To give a few more of the details, also written by David Cronenberg and Charles Edward Pogue, starring Jeff Goldblum as Seth Brundle, Gina Davis as Veronica Quaife, and John Getz as Stathis Baranis. I never get his name right. This is a remake of sorts of the 1958 version, which obviously starred Vincent Price. And I'll give a quick rundown of the plot. So, Seth Brundle is a brilliant scientist who has been working on an amazing technology, teleportation. At a party, he meets Veronica, a journalist for a science magazine, and he can't resist showing her the new technology. However, when she decides to go public with the information, Seth asks her to hold on and to document the rest of the development. As the work grows, so does their relationship. After a confusion about Veronica's previous lover and editor, Stathis, Seth teleports himself to prove that the technology works. However, a fly gets trapped in the teleportation pod with him, and the two become genetically fused. This fusion causes a mutation of Seth and the fly to something else, something new. He becomes Brundlefly. So, Julian, what's your initial thoughts of the 1986 film The Fly?
Well, I saw this when I was very young. I saw this, I must have been like 9 or something, maybe 10. Yeah, so I mean, it was really just amazing to me. I loved the body horror, although I didn't have that term then. But I'm amazed at how well it holds up. I think that it sort of starts slow. You sort of see like, oh, okay. There's sort of like outdated, gender roles, and you see the kind of clunky way in which the plot is just kind of setting up. Like, he brings a reporter back, doesn't seem to realize she's a reporter. He gets drunk and decides to use the machine. I mean, you see these ways in which it's just kind of setting up the plot. But once it gets going, I was amazed how much I thought it felt like a much older film. Even like a 30s film more than a 1950s film, that it ends with the defeat of the monster, and every scene is just sort of very functional. But it really, once it gets rolling, it's fantastic. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I'm the same. I was we live in an age now of films that are like 2.5 hours or plus, like, you know, these massive films. So when I sort of sat down and realized this is like 95 minutes, I was like, oh, good, this is a really concise, compact film. And it, like you say, it flies past. This film really goes for it. I mean, it opens and closes very, you know, almost without fanfare. Like, you know, I love the way they do that. Like the film opens just with Jeff Goldblum's Seth Brundle having the conversation with Gina Davis at the party.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of like, oh, I'm not. There's no preamble. There's no setting up the characters, or no setting up. You know, we're not going to try and give you all that stuff, or how we got to the party or whatever. Oh no, like we're at the party, and you're going to learn. You know, you're going to learn to know the characters as we go, and it just sort of drops you into it. And yeah, I actually really quite enjoy it. And I think the other thing I enjoy about this film is it's a small film.
Mm-hmm.
You know, really. I mean, I gave three cast members. I mean, there are other people involved, but predominantly, they're the three people that hold this film together, and that can usually be a good thing or a bad thing. But in this case, I think it's a really good thing. And you know, the top of that, I think Jeff Goldblum is excellent in this film. I think he does a really good job.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. I think both of us like sort of smaller, controlled stories. You know, we don't need all of those, you know, the explosive climax. And I agree about Goldblum. I think that Goldblum, is interesting that he sort of has this cult today. I mean, he sort of like became a meme. And as a result, like millennials all know Jeff Goldblum. But you know, it's amazing to me, especially once he starts becoming Brundlefly and he starts being absolutely manic, how great he really is.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, is that the transformation in this isn't just physical, is it? Like, there is a true personality change, and it's sort of, his portrayal of that is really good, because when you meet him, he's almost like that sort of quintessential sort of like 80s scientist. He's, you know, he's naive, he's a bit sort of awkward, he's you know, he's sort of slightly sort of you know, he's excited about the technology but not really sure how to interact with women. I mean, there's a part of me that wonders if it's funny when he is talking to Gina Davis and he takes her back to his apartment initially, like, you know, in any other film like that, that engagement would have been in him inviting her back to stay the night, you know, sort of like, oh, this is clearly going to end up with us sleeping together. But like, no, he is just excited about what he's done. He's like, look, this is amazing. Look what I've got. It's brilliant. And you're like, you're talking to, you've got Gina Davis back to your apartment. Like, you know, at least try and be a little bit more sort of charming. But no, I just think he's brilliant. And then once, like you say, once it sort of ramps up to, and the teleportation happens and stuff, and that transformation is sort of, it gets more aggressive and more sort of manic. It raises your concerns in the film. Like, you feel for him because there's clearly something wrong, and his physicality in the film is so sort of perfect for that sort of, you know, sort of his jerky movements at times, or the speed of the cadence with which he speaks. Like, he can control it and he can let it go, and he sort of, I think he's just really good in this film.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, for me, it really speeds up. You know, you're right that every scene is sort of very functional, just throws you right in. That reminds me of a much earlier cinematic style. And yet it's impossible to imagine. I mean, obviously this is in some sense a monster movie, right? It's this very simple plot, very few characters, and it's impossible to imagine a sort of, you know, 30s, you know, King Kong era monster movie that has this level of body horror, right?
Yeah.
But I feel like it's an amazing updating of that sort of formula. And I think you're right that it moves fast, and Goldblum really, for me, once he starts becoming Brundlefly, that he, you know, you have one incident after another as sort of, you know, the fingernails are coming off. He's starting to look more and more disheveled. You know, the back, those, you know, tear in his back is getting hairy, and it just keeps accelerating and accelerating, and it feels as if every 2 or 3 minutes you have another incident. Like it, it's as if you could make a whole series of gradations of this progression until finally the complete collapse of Goldblum's face at the end.
Yeah, which is horrific. Like I'd forgotten, like, as you said, like the special effects in this are really good. Like it's like an attention to detail, I think, at times that sort of just works. So it's one of the things I always sort of think about is escalation in films. Sort of like, where does it start and where does it end up? Because if you're taking like huge leaps to get to a certain point at some point, like I can be taken out of it. But with this, like you say, you have the physical and the sort of psychological change. But when they've got the special effects guys that are working on this, and I assume it's obviously David Cronenberg as well, like his attention to detail, because they start with, as you say, he's got a cut on his back from he lay on a microchip, and through the sort of the wound, like you say, the coarse hairs start to come through, and that's sort of, it looks quite good already. You already think, well, that's freaky and weird. But as he starts to transform, and as sort of like his body is changing, like there's that need for sugar, so he starts to ingest more sugar and that sort of thing, and he starts to get acne, like he starts to get spots. So they've even sort of given thought to the physical impacts of his diet and stuff like that. So it's the rest of his body is still fine because he keeps saying how energetic and perfect and purified he feels, but like his skin is getting sort of like mottled and is getting spots, and it's that first sort of for the first half of the film, even after the transformation, you're not entirely sure what's going to happen because it's still sort of like you can still say, oh, well, he's getting that, he looks that ill because of his diet, like because of what he's eating. And then it's obviously the first thing is when he bites that fingernail, and just like he's obviously annoyed and he bites his finger and it starts to come off, and his reaction to that. In fact, there's two scenes that are very close succession, which I really credit Jeff Goldblum for. Is he's had that sort of like reaction to Gina Davis, and he's sort of he's obviously angry, and he sort of goes to the mirror in the bathroom and he bites his finger and it comes off, and he's like, what the fuck is going on? What is this? Like, and he looks panicked and he sort of pulls them all off. And then the next scene is him, and he's got those gloves on. He's wearing a pair of sort of like, well, look like gardening gloves, really. And he's typing into the computer, and he discovers that he has been fused with a house fly. Again, it has some impossible technology that tells him how it happened, but
yeah,
I love his facial reaction. Is just that sort of like his eyes widen. It's just that, oh my god, like fusion was successful, and it's just like, oh no, not just teleportation, fusion, and you think that doesn't sound good, and it's just like his reaction is tells you everything you need to know. It's so well done.
Yeah, and I think another moment that's very well done is the moment when Gina Davis sort of like comes clean to him and says, I think something went wrong. And at the time, he's sort of convinced, no, it's just kind of purified me, and that's why I'm able to do all of this stuff that, reminds me very much of sort of like Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man testing his powers. And we haven't even talked about the climbing the wall scene, which I remember as a kid, and which is done brilliantly. But for me, that there's that pivotal scene in which she's kind of going along with this. She's not quite convinced. I mean, she's seen things like the sugar, things that don't really make sense, the hairs on the back. And you can feel sort of her horror of like, something's not right here. This went south. You think this is all fine, but something's wrong with you. And I love you enough to need you to understand this. And that's a pivotal moment in sort of that progression. And so I think she does a very good job too.
Yeah, they sort of work as a as a couple. And I think it's those two as the central core of this. They do seem to work really well. They have quite good chemistry throughout this, and I like the fact that he is so nerdy, and he plays it in a sort of like a, you know, almost like a semi-reclusive scientist, and you can believe that, and it's her that's bringing him out, like, you know, because the transformation sort of, there are parts where, you know, she buys him a leather jacket and she's sort of taking him out for coffee, and it's sort of like she is influencing him, and you can sort of see that that dynamic works really well, and I credit them both for it, that they work well together. And there are certain things that sort of we will say for a bit, but like plot contrivances that I think have to happen for certain things for things to happen, which is always the case with every film, and we'll get to those. But I also like the fact that, as you say, it seems a bit silly, but when he gets drunk and sort of, you know, and goes through the teleportation, like we've already seen one of the baboons. In fact, we'll go because the special effects I think are great. So when you first see the first baboon, he's able to teleport inanimate objects. When he does a stocking, he can do other things. And then when we see him try the first baboon to go through, and you don't know what to expect. And in part of my mind, and again, I watched this probably too young, a bit like yourself. I remember watching this and thinking like, oh, this is where he's going to prove that he can do it. Like, that's good. And then obviously as an older viewer, you're like, oh, no, this is the cock-up before the success.
Right.
And when you see that bloody handprint hit the inside of the teleportation pod, and they open it, and the inside-out baboon,
it's great.
It's amazing. And like I say, this is one of those films I watched it in HD. I watched this online in HD, and I was worried that the special effects and makeup would suffer because of HD, because there are films that, you know, look great probably in VHS back in the day or on television, but haven't aged well with HD. This looks amazing, and that baboon is horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I was less horrified by it this time through. I mean, I think even the like facial disintegration, I'm much more conscious of like, oh, okay, you're doing stop motion here, and I found myself thinking of the Inside Out baboon, like it doesn't seem to have enough mass. You know, it's not as big as the baboon, but I, you know, you can forgive these things, and those were things that I remembered as a kid being really horrifying. So I think they work. It is, you know, it's interesting. I mean, you know, we both like Videodrome as well, but it's interesting this sort of like preoccupation with the flesh, right?
Yes.
Not the new flesh of Videodrome, but the flesh. Yes. It's very strange, and it seems to fit with this depiction of Goldblum as a nerd who needs to come out of his shell and learn how to be a little more jockish or a little more cool, or how to get girls, and that sort of process happens. But I'm not sure, like, if we think of this as a Frankenstein story, that's certainly the case, but it's also a sort of parable about sex, about abortion. I mean, I'm surprised at all the abortion stuff in it, including an abortion nightmare. Yeah, so I mean, and as parable about sort of you know, the nerd versus you know, some sort of self-actuated individual.
Well, that's funny, because that feels very 80s to me. That sort of, because he actually says it. He has that sort of short monologue, doesn't he, about saying that right at the moment I've achieved my life's dream. I'm actually realizing who I am, and I've spent all this time on my sort of work, but not enough time on me. And it sort of seems like this sort of like 80s thing of, like you say, the jock of being able to get the girl and being cool and looking studly and all that sort of stuff. And it's sort of, there was always the nerds were always not the bad guys, but they were always probably, you know, they were always looked down upon, and they were the butt of the jokes in the 80s. And it feels like that's sort of part of this. Like, he starts, you know, I mean, this is Jeff Goldblum. He's a very good looking bloke, but he still feels like he starts in Revenge of the Nerds and goes, you know, and joins another clique, as it were. And And that says that so there's that self-actualization. But you say about the parable. The other thing that I sort of found interesting was, to me, this. I thought Frankenstein, and then I thought Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that sort of thing of sort of self-experimentation and something going wrong and something being introduced that changes you. I mean, in this, it's like literally he fuses with a fly. But I liked that sort of, it's almost the most extreme version of animalistic behavior. And he voices it later on as he's sort of like really changing. He says it's about insect politics. Have you ever heard of insect politics? And Gina Davis says, no. And he's like, well, because there aren't any. It's a pretty black and white world. And I'm going there and I'm scared that I'm going to hurt you because I'm going to lose my compassion. And I was interested to see that sort of like, that thing is sort of, again, that Jekyll and Hyde idea of sort of, as he gets more animalistic, he traverses through to almost sort of, he becomes more sort of virile and more sort of like energetic, but also sort of like, he's more aroused and sort of all this other stuff feels more animal. And then, he's going to come out, he's almost like going to come out the other end of all that and become just, I don't know whether it be logic or just, whatever it is. Instinct, I don't know, but I was interested to sort of see that it is that transformation is almost like regression in some way.
Right. I love what you're saying about Jekyll and Hyde, and I love the sort of I want to be the first insect politician sort of speech. It's so great, and he's so roundabout, and the audience realizes what he's saying before he hits the punchline of "If you don't leave, I'll hurt you." But I mean, the Jekyll and Hyde thing is more apt than Frankenstein, because there is this sort of point about what lays inside of us, right? That underneath that nerd exterior, maybe all of these male displays at intelligence and accomplishment are biologically programmed to try to get chicks. And, here, when you cut that cord in Jekyll and Hyde, horror comes out, right? And, this is very similar in that it's astounding how quickly he just ditches Gina Davis. He's like, oh, you don't, I need a perfect mate and you aren't willing. That's fine. I'll just get somebody else to go through this. And it doesn't really matter who she is, right? He picks up this woman, with whom he has no chemistry at all. But he does sort of become, another person and somebody who is much more ruthless and much more uncaring. And there is a sort of old-timey message almost about balancing civilization and insect ruthlessness or something.
I think that's right, because like you say, he becomes more ruthless. Is a good word for it, because everything becomes about drive. And like I say, when he goes out to, he's going out to prove a point. Like again, that the woman he chooses is opportunistic. Like there's no reason other than her being there for her to be chosen. Like it could have been any woman. And so, like it's almost that thing. So each time he does something with the teleportation pods, it seems to be about. It's almost like he's trying to prove something to Gina Davis. Like so, the first time he does it is because he thinks she has gone back to her former lover, her editor, Stathis. And then when he goes and gets another woman to do it, again he's trying to prove that no, I need someone to do it with me. Like there will be somebody else in the world that feels this way, because if you're not brave enough to do it, then I will find somebody. And it could there are other things that I've noted watching it this time, and I don't know if there's anything in it, but I mean Gina Davis, she's a former model, she's very statuesque, very sort of clear skin, and she's a very beautiful woman. And the woman he chooses is still very attractive, but she's got a lot of freckles, she's got red hair. I wouldn't say. Maybe I'm getting on some, but she's almost like not the opposite, but she's a very different look to Gina Davis. And I just thought there's something there about sort of like choosing choosing someone so different to Gina Davis. It
Yeah,
just
I
felt
noticed
like
that too, and I don't know what to think about that.
I might just read something, but it just felt, it almost felt intentional because they haven't gone for a conventional beauty. Like they choose someone who looks like a barfly, like
Yeah,
she looks lesser, and he's going to sort of like, he wants to sort of bestow this gift upon her, and I just found that like like an odd thing.
it is odd. Can we talk about how absurd this technology is? Um,
Yes, yeah,
like the fact that it can teleport is the least interesting thing about it. Jeff Goldblum has basically created Skynet, and
yeah,
he's created a computer that is able to scan every molecule of being, including it would have to be because it can keep the memories intact, right? It answers questions like an advanced AI. It responds
yeah.
to voice commands. It can, when it has to teleport two things at the same time, it just splices the genes together on the fly to create a genetically viable result. Like, yeah, that's and also like he teaches it the poetry of the flesh. Like this is some advanced technology. The teleportation's cool, but you have Skynet here.
Yeah. Well, there's actually a really interesting point in this film where because that's really, because obviously you're talking about an AI, so you're talking about it's almost like a learning computer. But one of the first things he says about why the thing can't teleport flesh is because he says machines are dumb. Machines are stupid. They only do what you tell them to do. But then, like you say, it seems to learn things pretty quick when given the opportunity. Like you say, when it makes decisions. Oh, instead of sort of like identifying, which I thought would be, now this is the thing I actually thought this on. If it was to identify two separate genetic patterns in a pod, a failsafe which shuts it down would probably be a better decision than going, all right, well I'll combine the two. It's a bit like
Yeah.
sort of.
Well,
You don't do that in cooking. You don't do it in cooking, do you? You don't go, well, I've got a bag of flour and a bag of mud. I'll throw them together, see what happens.
Yeah, the thing I have a pet peeve about organic matter being somehow different, right? As if it has a soul or something, which Star Trek doesn't do. But even as a kid, I was confused by why the fly, and I would think like, I mean, obviously there's a sort of like fly in the ointment kind of metaphor of like the thing you don't think about, right? But I would find myself thinking like there are plenty of amoebas and paramecia in this pod. Why doesn't it identify those, right? I mean, there's plenty of bacteria and all kinds of stuff. If you teleport, and then you think like, well, if you teleported a bag of flour, does it I mean, it has an idea of what constitutes a bag of flour because it would transport that bag of flour, presumably. It doesn't say there's a bag and there's flour. These are made of different things. Let's make a melange.
Yeah. Yeah. I was wondering that. It's funny you said, because one of the things I did think about in this case was like, and you couldn't travel in this if you had nits.
Yeah.
If you had like headlights, or you had, even if you had like you say, what happens with the things that are internal to you? Because you've got certain like bacteria and other things inside you, so it just felt bizarre. And like you say, if you were to put some eggs, some flour, some sugar and butter together, does it come out as on the other end? Does it come out as cake mix? I don't know. It could be used for different things. But there was a lot of questions in this. So I was a bit like, I'm not sure this works as well as I think he thinks it works.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right, and that's very funny. But I am sort of perplexed by this idea of thingness, by how we look and we think, oh, that's a tree, that's the ground that the tree is in. What exactly is the line of molecules that separate one thing from another? Why is why is that a distinct thing in our brains? And that doesn't really make sense translated to a machine. How does the machine's not going to think, oh, that that culture in your gut is part of you, but that fly isn't. It is very strange.
It's and again, it's one of those sort of things of it's movie science, isn't it? It's like, well, why? Well, because of science, and and they try their best in many ways because they answer other questions that I've had about other things in the past in other films. They actually try to answer in this film. So, like he admits that machines are dumb, so that it does do some pretty special things. But the other thing that they answer in this film is, like you say, he introduced the two pods, and they are some pretty, they are pretty iconic looking. Like, as a design and as a sort of a prop, because a physical. That's the thing as well to remember. This is 1986, so no CGI. These are all physical, and they look brilliant, and they all work. Like the doors open, and not as pods, obviously, but as as special effects. But like I say, so they look great, and you do go, wow. Did he build those? And he actually says that the answer in the film again. He says, "Oh no! I don't make this stuff. I farm it out to sort of like much more intelligent people than I am. So, I ask people, can you create me this, and somebody else, can I create you that, and da da da." And then he brings them together and puts them together. And I was like, "That's a good idea," because they don't know what the project is. They don't know what the bigger project is. But I'm asking them to do this and to do that, and I bring them together. I was like, "That's nice and neat and smart like that." All right. You've passed that piece of information. It's a nice little bit of exposition. I'm happy to move on from that. Where in other films, I've watched things where they've got some sort of great technology, and you go, that's quite difficult to make,
right?
Because you must be like some sort of like you must be able to do like a simple task, like not simple task, but like an engineering task, like welding, as well as advanced physics, as well as advanced engineering. So
yeah,
I like the fact that they've got that. Go on.
I really dug that explanation too. But the thing that I like that. I'm glad that it's there. I think it's very clever. But I also found myself thinking, I mean, it sort of represents like, well, I'm smart, I'm a genius, but I'm not. These other people are smarter than me, and I wouldn't know how to make a laser, right? Okay, I'm not sure what you're using the laser for. You certainly have farmed out teleportation technology, right? Somebody's got like a device. You can't just order, a device that scans every molecule of something, identifies what it is, and teleports it. I mean, the idea that this is just made up of these constituent parts that can sort of be ordered almost over the counter, I thought was very funny. Although it's a much better explanation than most movies give.
Yeah, and it's the fact that they clearly want to keep him the mad scientist. Like, they have him in this sort of very stripped down warehouse type apartment, and they clearly want him to be detached. I mean, if this was, if this was to be in a lab, like if he was working for Cyberdyne Systems, let's say, like you wouldn't question about the building of the pods at all, because you're like, okay, he works for an advanced science and technology company. Of course, they would build it for him. So I'm glad they try and give an explanation for it. But you're right, like there'd still be somebody, because I assume this is quite a small community at this level of intellect, where one of them's going, yeah, do you know that Brundle? He asked me to build him this laser. Oh, really? Oh, he was asking me about something the other week, and I've built him this other thing. And they go, well, what is he doing that put these things together? I'm sure that someone would start to figure it out, or would have questions. But I suppose that's sort of that's sort of going down a bit of a rabbit hole.
But it's also like, where is the technology that does the teleportation? Like in the film, it destroys the original and then recreates it elsewhere. Like on Star Trek, that's quite responsible. On Star Trek, we understand that, yes, technically the original has to be destroyed, and then this data is transmitted to somewhere else, and then matter is sort of built spontaneously out of energy. This machine is able to build matter spontaneously, to shape matter with intricate detail. I mean, way beyond any 3D printer. Not just in resolution, but also the variety of materials that it uses. But I mean, of course, we're overthinking this, right? Because it's a device that allows the plot to work. I'm just thinking, like, yeah, he ordered a laser for me. He ordered something that would evaporate matter from me.
Yeah.
What part was that?
Yeah. He's ordered something that disintegrates things. And someone's going, oh my God, he's at it again. What's he up to? Like, there must be some sort of check. Because they do actually say he works for a company, and I forget, is it Bartok he actually works for? 'Cause they're the ones because it's Bartok Technology in the sequel.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think that there would be some sort of, they leave me alone because I don't cost very much. And again, I'm like, oh, I can sort of accept that.
Yeah,
and maybe that was the case. Yeah, maybe that's acceptable in the 80s, but again, you'd think there'd be some sort of, someone checking in that says, Seth, I'm really glad you're doing a fantastic job. Your patents you keep creating are really paying off for the company, and the shareholders are fascinated and really appreciate what you're doing. But why have you ordered a disintegration ray?
Yeah.
We're a little concerned about that. Could you just sort of provide a little bit of explanation?
Also, you're living in your lab, which is apparently like a warehouse in the bad part of town, which I quite like.
Yeah.
Like you think, oh, rent's probably cheap there. Although you never see any neighbors, right? I'm glad you don't see like the stereotypical 80s gangs hanging out with boomboxes and mohawks or something. But I like the idea that, he's gotten this place cheap or something, although it is a vast space. I mean, it's impossible to imagine this film in another space, like those sort of collapsing pipes along the wall as you approach the main door to the warehouse or whatever, are so memorable.
But I was gonna say, well, the thing is, following gentrification, like that apartment now costs like sort of like thousands and thousands of pounds a month to rent.
Yeah, forget the teleporter. Just hold on to that real estate.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that's where you make your money. Like, in my head canon, like he owns the building. I've always wondered, like because they allude to the fact that he's been involved in some like really big projects in the past, and I always wonder, like, okay, so like he must like hold some patents on some technology or something that's paying for this, because he lives a very stripped down life. I love the fact he follows the Einstein theory of having 5 sets of clothes, so we can just pick out the next thing on the rack and that sort of thing. I like little details like that. That's very sort of nerdy and very sort of like fits in. But there's still questions around sort of about how are you financing this and how do you finance your life and doing this and that sort of. So it's interesting. But I mean, like, going back to the whole thing of it being that mad scientist, like that's his castle, isn't it? This is like Frankenstein's castle on the hill. This is that thing of secluded, but still looks sort of like modern Gothic in a sort of slightly broken down way.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I mean, and that never had occurred to me before that this is that sort of castle, and much like the castle, there's sort of like twists and turns, and there's corridors, and it's a very sort of like vague, expansive space.
Yeah, and that's they say. Yeah, there's a general geography to the apartment, but like you say, it's never really confirmed, is it? And I love that. Say that it's the one of my favorite spaces in the apartment building is that corridor that seems to run down the side of the building to his door, which they light to perfection, depending on the mood. So there's a bit where the bit where he's rejected Gina Davis, and she's sort of like she's cast out of the apartment, and she's walking down it, and there's like a really good like blue light sort of coming through the windows and stuff, and it's sort of. They utilize the building it really well to sort of set a mood, and I quite like that because his building is very bare.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I don't understand why that corridor is there. It doesn't seem to be there all the time. Sometimes you just cut to them going inside. I'm not sure why there's this exterior corridor. And then when he brings the sort of barfly home, he's going upstairs, and he's going up quite a number of flights of stairs. Where are those stairs? That
actually hit me because I was like that doesn't seem like the same. But is it? I thought at one point he was going back to hers or something, but I was like that seems like a really different building. Like that doesn't make any sense. But it is. I
don't care really, but I mean, it is
no.
odd.
I think the thing they do try and they create two vastly different worlds, though, and I think that's the other thing I really like about this film. That's sort of is again in the detail is like I say, his apartment is this sort of like let's say call it the modern Gothic sort of thing. It's got this stripped down bare apartment, bare brick walls. The electrics are out, the pipes are out. I love the fact that his living area is a rug, a large square rug in the middle of the room that has a sofa and a table and a sort of like a filing cabinet and stuff on it. And the rest is just his lab. And the way it's lit is it's lit to be cold. It feels very sort of like the lighting is very sort of stark, and you get to see the brickwork, and it's just very sort of stark. When you go elsewhere, it goes back to that sort of like 80s style. So the two places I'll call out really are Gina Davis's apartment. You see briefly, is very sort of it's not cluttered. Cluttered's the wrong word, but it's full. It's the design guys or the sort of they've put stuff in there, like it's got all kinds of there's rugs on the wall and the shelves are full of stuff and there's books and there's a full kitchen and all this other stuff. Like she has a life, and they really want to hammer home that there's a life there. And then the same goes for sort of the apartment, the office, Stathis' office. Again, the way it's filmed, it's got that yellow light. It's warm. It's it would have been modern for 1986. It's opulent. It's that sort of thing. Like all this is in stark contrast to Brundle's lab, and I love the fact that it's sort of like he is this crazy scientist, like locked away in this sort of like brick building, in the same city as all this sort of like modern living, and I just think it forms like a nice contrast of him versus the outside world.
Yeah, and that contrast, that's a good point, and that contrast is so extreme that when he shows up at the office in one of the early scenes, I think it's the only time he goes to either of those locations. We see him at the party at the beginning, and we see him at the bars. I think outside of that, he doesn't ever go out. But when we see him at that office, in that brightly lit office, he looks completely different. It's almost shocking to see him in that environment.
Yeah, he looks. They play him. He looks uncomfortable. Like he feels out of place, and this is where I think Jeff Goldblum's in his element, because he can play that sort of like gawky. He's 6'4", 6'5", and sort of very thin, and so he looks awkward in that space, and I think that's really sort of obviously intentional. One thing I will say is, and this is something again, like you say, if we say nitpicks, I don't know how well science magazines were doing in the 80s, but Particle magazine seems to be doing incredibly well, because that office space with that view in New York City, which I assume is where it is, or any big city, must cost a fortune. And so an editor of a large magazine, he must be doing incredibly well. I didn't realise science magazines paid so well at that period. It just seemed really off to me this time.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you do see an exterior shot where, I forget what it's like, something Enterprises, like very formal, and it's presumably a publishing conglomerate that owns this. So I assume that, the offices for Particle magazine are, just shoved into the larger conglomerate offices. But, also I remember, reading science magazines in the 80s. There's a reference to Omni magazine, and Gina Davis says, like, well, if you won't, I'll take the story to Omni if you don't believe me, early on. And, you're still right that I can't imagine these science magazine editors were working out of stockbroker like offices, but it was also cool, like imagining, like it's such a fantasy of that sort of culture of 80s science magazines, that like they did investigative journalism. No, they did not. Right. They ran stories on, stuff like mutation, where you think like today, this was rather scrounged together and you might have commissioned some art, and they did lots of great stuff. But the idea that they're I found myself wondering, how long are you employing Gina Davis off the clock to just hang out with her now boyfriend? You know, she's living with him. She's basically just videotaping stuff and preparing for a story. This has gone on, I don't know. I mean, months? You're employing a reporter for months on an investigative story for a science magazine?
Yeah, and that's it, because I was never quite sure. Is she sort of like freelance, or is she actually work for them, or it's never quite clear, is it? But like you say, she sort of spends the time frame for this film is never fully clear. Like, is it weeks or is it months? Because there is a point where towards the end of the film, like they've had a falling out, they've separated, and he's carrying on, and this is when you sort of you eventually find how degraded he has become. And she does say, like, I've thought about contacting you. You know, I haven't spoken to you for weeks, and I've wanted to speak out. So it clearly takes over at least a couple of months. But like the start, you say the start of the film seems to be just like a couple of weeks. But yeah, it's interesting. Sort of, I don't know the timescales of this. Like in that time as well, like has she gone back and been doing sort of just going back and sort of picking up other stories of science stuff?
Yeah, I don't know. What has she been doing?
Yeah.
You know, she doesn't seem to be back with the ex-boyfriend. But you know, also she's been pregnant, right? And the implication, you know, which you know is never really resolved in this film, is that it might be Brundlefly's child, right? That's clearly what she's scared of. And you know, Brundle is. There's that great line when he says, it could be the last bit of me, right? I mean, this could be a part of me that survives. So, you know, I love that, but the implication is that she got pregnant after the teleportation, and thus, you know, to even be aware of the pregnancy, it's got to have been more than a month.
Yeah, and that's it. So it's sort of must lay out at least, like you say, 6 to 12 weeks, really. So this might even take a period of like 6 months, really. Because with that pregnancy is actually an interesting point, because her reaction is understandable at this point, because she's seen what's happening to him, and then to know that there's something wrong. I don't think she knows at this point he's been fused. Oh no, does she know that he's been fused with a fly? Yes, she does, because that's when she has the, like you said, the abortion nightmare. And that is again like this horrific notion of like what is it that's grown in me, because it's not technically human, you know, or it'll be partly human, but what else could it be? And so that birth scene is quite traumatic. So her reaction is understandable.
One reason I really like the birth scene is that, you know, this is a sexist movie in a lot of ways. You know, and I don't think in a way that I want to, you know, disparage. You know, I'm not singling it out for criticism, but it's an 86 movie, right? And so, you know, the ex-boyfriend is in her apartment showering, and he says, "Oh, you gave me a key, remember?" You know, it's like, and he refuses to give it back. And of course, he's kind of being set up as the villain or the competition in a love triangle, and he winds up being the stereotypical hero. But and you have all of this body horror, and that's a very male genre, and obviously it's happening to the man. But then you have this wonderful abortion nightmare sequence, which, you know, sort of recalls Alien and some of the fear of childbirth, some of the fear of what the hell is this growing inside me.
Yeah, I think, like I say, it plays out really well, and it looks good. Again, like, you know, there's obviously some like animatronic maggot that she gives birth to, and also a cameo by David Cronenberg as the Doctor, which is wonderful. But yeah, I find Stathis is an interesting character, because he's a horrible person. Like, he is a vile misogynist, but at no point, like he like you say, he has a bit of a sort of a redemptive moment at the end. But throughout the rest of the film, like at no point does David Cronenberg, the director, ever try to redeem him in any other way. You know what I mean? Like he never changes his character. Like no, he is a smug misogynist git, and he should not be liked. And they are fine showing you that, and like even he's called out and he acknowledges it, because at some points like Gina Davis is like, "You are a real scumbag," and he's like, "Yeah." It's just who I am. And so I almost sort of, I understand, like you said, there's this misogyny, but I almost applaud it that at no point does it cower away from saying and it's bad. Like at no point does he say, but he's just being he's just being a bloke, he's just being a boy's boy or a man's man. No, the film acknowledges that no, he is not a nice person. And well, he's driven by jealousy and obsession in many ways.
Yeah, that's true. And there is, when Gina Davis is talking to Goldblum about that relationship, she explains that she was his student. And so that's how they met. Is that not only is he, this sort of misogynist who says, well, I know the relationship's over, and you're dating somebody else, but can we still have sex? Which is, a key scene. But then, through dialogue, we're led to believe that, I guess that they met in college, which makes him even, I mean, I can't imagine, a professor being that over the top. But although it was 1986, so who knows? Yeah. But it does help to explain why she would be attracted to him, or why she would have him as an ex-partner. That basically she was young, and he had this sort of power. It doesn't make it right, but it's amazing. Like with these comments, along with the comment of sort of like how I farm out parts of the teleportation pods to other people, how much this film does kind of address some of these issues in dialogue in ways that do kind of answer these questions, or at least smooth them over enough that they don't bother you.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, there's always an allusion to stuff that's gone on in the past. Like, again, like this story's taken place to people that have a history. And I kind of like that, like you said, there is clearly sort of a rather complicated relationship between sort of, Gina Davis's character and John Gett's character. Like that, there's something there. And going back, like, if that's the fact that, like, that was the relationship, and he is now the editor of a magazine. Is that why she's working there? Is that why she gets a little bit of, a longer lead maybe for certain things than other journalists on that magazine because of that relationship? Like, right. He jokes at one point about, when Brundle turns up at the office, is, if you're going to make anybody else disappear, I've got a junior editor that has served his purpose. So you get the feel like he's probably not great to his staff. He probably is quite ruthless, but he lets Gina Davis sort of get away with things, and it's probably because of that sort of like physical and that lust that is there between them.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, and even that goes a long way to explaining some of these plot holes. And it's amazing how in a short film, especially these days, with so many films being over 3 hours, how, obviously you've got to buy into teleportation in 1986, right? I mean, you got to buy into this AI and everything else. But, outside of that, with a small cast and very controlled story, it's amazing how consistent it is and how successful it is, especially in sort of ratcheting up the horror, ratcheting up scene by scene, and following through on those implications. Not just introducing another, like, well, I'm from so-and-so company and, we just bought you out or something. There's nothing like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what, because if this was to be remade or was to be made today. That's exactly what happened. Like, you would have representatives from, they wouldn't just mention the Bartok company. Like, oh no, there would be representatives from the Bartok company. There would be more tension between that. They would expand that story, because there's this desire for expansive storytelling at the moment, which sometimes I find is just becomes bloated and sort of like ends up collapsing under its own weight. And this is, like I say, it's small, it's concise. I mean, if this was to be a book, it would be a novella or a short story. Like, this isn't a full blown novel, is it? Like, it's kept short and concise, and really benefits for that. I mean, it breaks into acts. Like, there are clear acts. There's the sort of development of everything, the introduction of the characters, the development leading up to the teleportation. Okay, that's the end of Act 1. Move on to Act 2. You get the build up of sort of like Seth becoming different, his transformation, his change, how he basically goes physically and mentally sort of starts to change, and his desires. That's your Act 2, and then eventually the Act 3 kicks off when she does go for the abortion. Like, she sees him,
Right.
and you see how far he's gone, and then it's sort of like it's a really well structured story. Like, it just sort of it goes on at pace, and it's a well laid out story, I think.
Yeah, amen. And I could use more well structured stories these days.
Yes.
So often, whether it's TV or cinema, I think, you have broken the 3-act structure, and I'm not sure that it got you anything. Obviously there's a traditional 5-act structure too, which you can adapt for a 3-hour long film. But, there's a lot to be said for a film that gets in, does its job, and gets out. And yeah, maybe it follows a traditional structure, but it works. And I think that if you showed this film to a 20-year-old, they'd probably say, oh, okay, it's a little slow here. That special effect isn't so great, but it still works. It still works as a film. It still drew my attention, and I still, enjoyed it. I could get into it, and I'm done in 95 minutes.
Yeah, I think that's it. Especially say if as you go into the third act, like because you've got sort of quite a small cast, like you feel this thing sort of centers around that love triangle, and then when you're introduced to the sort of almost like the pre-final stage of Brundlefly, and he sort of he is sort of starting to transform. He's sort of hunched over, and he's sort of covered in what the makeup effects, and he looks great. It looks good, and it's disgusting, and bits of him are falling off, and his hair's all going and stuff, and it's sort of. But that, like you said, that conversation he has when he sort of, because obviously, so Gina Davis goes to have an abortion like late at night, and they sort of say, like, the doctor's like, but why now? And they're just like, look, there's an element of deformity involved in this. She wants to get the abortion. Just do me a favor. And he comes crashing through that glass and sort of abducts her, and it sort of again goes back to, as you said, a monster movie, whether it be like The Hunchback of Notre Dame or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or Frankenstein or whatever, abducting to say damsel in distress is that sort of part of it. But then they have that conversation about sort of like, and he's sort of saying to her, as you said, about the baby, and he's like, look, don't kill the baby. It's the last piece of humanity left of me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of like, it's because you follow this along, it's really, for me at least, but I wouldn't say heartbreaking, but I really feel it, that he's like, he really is desperately trying to cling on to something. Like, what am I becoming? I don't know. I no idea what I'm actually going to end up being, but I've got to have something to cling on to. And I feel there's that desperation in that third act, and I feel that's what drives Brundle towards the end, is desperation. So the decision he makes, and he's obviously already made the decision, is he wants us to use fusion again through the teleportation to become more human, or to at least remain human. And the only way you can do it is by fusing with one or more purely human figures, people. And so he's set up the 3 pods. So he's actually got a prototype that he's now introduced into this sort of trio of pods. And you're sort of thinking, I'm going back to that idea he had about insect politics.
Mm-hmm.
he said about how if you don't go away, I'm going to hurt you. How much of this is human desire, but being driven by insect logic? Almost like, well, I want to do this, and the way to do it is to do this and this, and here's the subject I've got. You know what I mean? But he keeps trying to sort of like butter it up by saying, "But we'll be the perfect family."
Yeah.
All in one, which is really creepy. And
Yeah,
it
I
made
like
me think
that.
about but again, it made me sort of think of that idea of politics of like, the spin, trying to sort of butter up the idea of what's going to happen. And I was like, oh, it's just the human condition is to sort of, is to lie. You are selfish. Like at this point, he's so desperate, he's willing to sacrifice sort of like the woman he claims to love and his child to save his own life, or at least to some extent, because whatever comes out of it. So I don't know. I just think that decision, and it feels sort of like understandable, but also terrifying.
Yeah, I think you understand it very well. I think that I almost felt like in that third act that he seems more conscious than he did at the end of the second act. I felt, I mean, he tells her to go away. I don't know how he found out that she was pregnant, by the way, or made his way across town. But I don't really care. But I do feel as if, especially in those final scenes back in the warehouse or his home, that he is more conscious. I mean, he's obviously planning. I think you're right to interpret it as a sort of like human desire to be united with somebody. And there is this sort of like really creepy version of love or a family that's invoked there. And I do think that it's heartbreaking, especially when, Gina Davis has to tell him something's really wrong. And then, when she's thrown out, and then at the end, not wanting to kill him. And, I can only imagine what I thought at 9 as the, Brundle holds the shotgun up to his own face, unable to speak, but clearly communicating, "Kill me."
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm saying. This whole third act, when they get back to the sort of Brundle's lab, is again, it's sort of everything's so sort of like it all comes full circle. It comes back to this lab, it comes back to the technology, and it's sort of again just those three people, and you get sort of like Stathis comes in with a really over the top gun. To be fair, I'm sure it's like an elephant gun or something like that, but and also just to point the fact, like he basically goes into the building having seen what what Brundle has become, and the fact that Brundle has kidnapped, smashed through a window and kidnapped Gina Davis. He carries the dismantled gun into the apartment and then builds it.
Yes.
When common sense would be like, I'll do this outside so I can go in armed. Clearly that's, but again, a nitpick.
Also,
yeah,
maybe get some police support, right? Maybe don't go to the bad guy's lair with an unassembled gun by yourself.
Yeah. Because it's not like he's on his own. Because at this point, like that doctor's also seeing, not seeing what Brundle is, but he's seeing like, someone smashed through the window of my office and kidnapped a woman. I think he would be fully justified in calling the police. But I love the fact that when it comes back, is this thing of like his defense. He uses his digestive system as a sort of as a defense mechanism or as an attack. And he melts Stathis's hand, and he also melts his foot off using his digestive fluid, which is again like some of the horror in this and some of the special effects is it's horrific. But I love his underplaying of it. Like it's not screaming and shouting and throwing himself around. It's just the sort of like he looks at his own hand melting. And he's struggling to process what he is seeing, and he's just sort of like stunned into sort of like with pain. Like, he's in shock, like you can see he's going grey, and it's sort of like it's so well it's so well done. I really enjoy this sort of third act, and again like the special effects of when Gina Davis is trying to resist him, and finally you get the final transformation. Like she pushes him so far, and his jaw comes off. and then his body or his outer body starts to fall away, like his eyes liquefy and all this other stuff, and you get Brundlefly underneath, which, it's a slightly jerky animatronic, but still, as a practical effect,
Hmm.
it looks really good. I mean, what do you think of that sort of that confrontation at the end?
Yeah, I mean, I like it. I mean, I am able to forgive its trespasses. I found myself thinking about the issue of abortion and thinking of, I mean, this is an 86 film. It's not scared to really, there's an abortion sequence which occurs in a
Mm-hmm.
dream. I can't imagine that not being, you know, controversial. I can't imagine that getting, too widespread distribution today. Yet at the same time, Brundle says that we'll be united a family. And there, earlier we were talking about thingness, right? Like
Mm.
how is the fly different than the stuff in your gut? Is the machine going to recognize a separate thing in her stomach? That's kind of important for that climax, but we don't have a clear answer to that. It's clearly, not a very well developed, child at this point. I'm not sure if it's even a fetus, but if it is, it's not big.
Mm.
So I mean, not only is there this, just sort of like abortion isn't a big deal, right? She
Yeah.
struggles with it, but it's just like an accepted thing. And it's amazing how far we've retreated from that in
Yeah.
2019. But it's also interesting if we're going to talk about sort of like female body horror of that abortion sequence and how this film is gendered, how, is the child, would they really be a family, or is this her body? I mean, is
Mm.
the machine going to say, well, that's a separate bit of DNA, so now you're all fused together? I don't know. I also find myself sort of thinking about, are they going to be one mind after this? How does that work?
That was interesting because that's it wasn't until just discussing this that sort of what's popped into my mind is sort of like, well, obviously the fly doesn't have a memory or anything like that per se, so he remains, at least in his brain for the most part, he remains Seth Brundle. But yeah, if you were to combine him and the Veronica character, if it's able to transport, if that fly hadn't have gone in there, it would have just transported him normally. And he was able to retain like all his skills, all his memories, all his all that sort of stuff. So it's obviously all that is being retained. So yeah, what would it retain in if it combined the two of them?
I don't know.
Yeah, I'll be interested. Yeah, it's an interesting because the other thing, of course, is I mean, granted, the technology has been shot at and it gets damaged before the final sort of like moments. But Brundle does get teleported to the third pod, and he fuses with part of the pod.
Mm-hmm.
But when he comes out, it isn't like previous. It's not like he's gone fusing and then eventually you will become metal or you'll become a piece of electrical wire. Like it's the fly, but with flesh wrapped around parts of the pod. Like he pulls
Yeah.
himself out and it trails behind him what is clearly plastic electrical wire. So is that because it's an animate and an inanimate object fused together? So it leaves a question of like what would have come out of that pod. What would have come out of that pod if it had been successful. Now, apparently, though, do you know if there's a deleted scene that sort of tried to address this?
Is that the scene that they used in The Fly 2? Or is there just another
Possibly.
deleted scene? Okay.
I can't remember. So there's a scene that was used in initial audience screenings, but was removed because they felt it sort of removed empathy from Seth Brundle. But he fuses the second baboon and a cat together, to see what would happen when you. I haven't seen it. Apparently, it must be out there. But he fuses a baboon and a cat together, and when it doesn't work, he beats it to death with a pipe.
Wow.
Yeah, and people are a bit like, yeah, I don't really care to follow Seth Brundle after this, so they removed it. So it's I assume it's clearly part of that final that it must be part of that third act or that sort of lead up to the third act where he's considering how to fuse live matter together.
Right, sort of. He's practicing for fusing himself in another human being.
But I've never seen it. I've just heard about it. So it would be interesting to see what that looks like.
I haven't seen it either, but you're right to suggest that. And I love the fusion with the part of the pod and how part of the pod is itself teleported. And I think that's all great. But you're right to point out that this does seem to be a different kind of fusion. And of course, maybe the machine's damaged. But yeah, the other thing is I'm never quite sure why the effects of the fusion with the fly take a while to manifest, why they slowly manifest. And, one can imagine if he's fused with Gina Davis. I mean, he's just going to come out looking the same, right? Like Brundlefly. But, then what? Parts of him are going to slowly change into a woman? I don't know.
Well, that's it. Yeah, would he become asexual? Would he be able to reproduce internally? Would he be still human? It's interesting. It's a fact. It's maybe there's a story there. I don't know. Because because the thing is, like in this, it's a full transformation. Like it's taken as body horror, and they go the full, the full Brundlefly. And I suppose it's worth sort of mentioning the original because the original is still iconic and. It's sillier. It's 1958. It's a slightly sillier film. It's a very B movie kind of film. I'm assuming you've seen.
No, I've never seen it actually.
Have you not? Oh, okay.
I've never seen it. We might have to do it on another episode.
It is worth seeing for that sort of the 50s kitsch of it all, and like Vincent Price is very good in it. I always like seeing a bit of Vincent Price. But in it, like it has there's an element of Dr. Strangelove about it, which is it verges into comedic. So we may do it in the future, but I'll just tell you this now. So in Dr. Strangelove, there's the thing of Peter Sellers when he's sort of the former Nazi, and he can't stop his arm from saluting, and he has to keep.
Oh yeah.
So in the 58 version, the scientist he does the same thing. He does teleportation. And instead of changing fully, it's one arm, it's his head and one arm has become a fly.
Right.
And there's a scene where he is battling his own arm. So he battles the fly arm with his good arm to prevent him from killing his wife. And it is that sort of thing of like, it verges on. And I could see why in the 50s, in a sort of like a drive-in kind of way, it's entertaining and it's good fun. But it does come across as a bit silly. But the ending is they have to track down the fly that obviously he teleported with because they don't combine in this. They come out and there's two separate. They remain two separate entities. But while the human has a fly head and a fly arm, the fly has a little diddy human head and a little diddy arm, and so it ends it with the. It ends. I'm going to spoil it because it's still worth seeing, but it's it ends with the little fly in a spider's web out in the garden, and you just get this little sort of high pitch like "Help me! Help me!" And just before he's about to be eaten by the spider, his son has to crush him with a rock. And so, like, you sort of go through this sort of like slightly silly sort of B movie 50s horror that ends on this really dark note.
Yeah.
And so it's good. It's a slightly silly film. It's worth seeing, but it's very 50s. It's just very kitsch. I do think this is the better film. The 1986 version.
Well, and the difference between sort of kitsch and body horror, obviously Cronenberg was sort of be associated with that, and now sort of horror movies are filled with a lot of this body horror. It used to be just Cronenberg doing it, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of it sort of goes on. Let's say a lot of influence. This film is sort of, has Cronenberg in general, really. I think sort of has influenced an awful lot of that sort of body horror and sort of horror in general, really. But the other thing I that sort of struck me about the 80s, and I think maybe there were other times, but watching this made me also think of The Thing, which is another film we might do one day because it's a great sci-fi horror. But it made me think about how to do a remake and do it well. So,
Right.
Both of those, so The Thing, 1981's The Thing, or 1982's The Thing, and 1986 The Fly,
Right.
both take sort of those 50s movies and sort of, do them, but do them in a very distinctive way. Like, you
Right.
couldn't say this is a remake in sort of probably concept and name alone. Much like The Thing, is really sort of a remake in concept and sort of name alone of The Thing and The Thing from Outer Space. So
Right.
I just like the fact that they sort of like that Cronenberg sort of did his own thing with this, and I think that's why it stands alone as a classic rather than people don't call this it's a remake of the 1958 Fly. Like no, do you like when people say do you like The Fly, everyone's referring to David Cronenberg's The Fly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it really points to the need to make a remake your own. Nobody but Cronenberg could have done this movie. Obviously, it updates, it makes it more realistic, for one, but adds, these elements of body horror, adds these sort of, themes of, sexuality and abortion and the nerd versus the jock and stuff like that. That is fascinating. And I think that sometimes we get these remakes. We live in a time in which we're getting a lot of remakes now. But, sometimes they go their own direction. And sometimes they sort of slavishly follow the original, with an updated cast or, younger actors or more diverse actors or what have you. Better special effects. And, I guess I would just encourage people to say, when there is a remake that is different, that is a director's weird take on something, hey, that's how we got The Fly. That's how we got The Thing. And even if that take doesn't wind up being as successful as these two examples, it's important and almost incumbent upon any director, including a director of Shakespeare, a director of plays that are done over and over. It's the most successful versions have a stamp of that director on them. And I think it's a bit silly not to expect that.
No, I totally agree. I think, they need to be given, and to tell these stories for a different age and a different audience through different, through different eyes can be just as important, I think, as if you want to do an original story and stuff. But as I say, I think sometimes Hollywood could just sort of like benefit to look back at films like this and say, yeah, do you know what, we're going to trust that author, that creator, that director to do his thing, and it will likely pay off. But
well, I just realized I feel very old because the time between the original movie The Fly and the Cronenberg remake that we grew up with and is now no reference as The Fly is less than the time between that film and today.
Yeah. Yes, I was just looking at the dates and thinking exactly the same thing. Yeah, but that's it. It was, we've talked about The Fly. It's a great film. It's one I definitely recommend. It's one of those films that, as you said earlier, it definitely still stands up. This is a film that I think you can go and watch and still is impactful and can pull you in.
Oh
But
man.
yeah, so Julian, what's your final thoughts then on The Fly?
My final thought is arguably the best superhero movie ever. This is the Spider-Man that I want to see. Get on that, Sony.
Yeah. This is a film that Venom could have been. This is the sort of the body horror that we could have for sort of a film like that. That would be amazing. Yeah, no, I'm the same. I think there's something in this sort of idea of that's so body horror in itself can be so sort of impactful because it's sort of you can't stop it, especially when Paul Brundle can't stop this thing happening to his body, and with the rise of illnesses that can impact us, everything from sort of like cancer or anything really. This idea of something inside you that you can't fight, it can feel so real. So I just think there's so much this film that's worth revisiting.
Oh man,
and yeah, so I've really enjoyed watching this again actually.
Yeah, me too. I was surprised. I mean, I hadn't seen it for a good decade, and I was surprised how well it worked. Especially, it's short, but I mean, give it through that first act, right? Give it 45 minutes or 30 minutes, and no, then you're pretty much on a roller coaster. You've set everything up, and I think both of us really admire those, not just smaller films, but films that follow through on their implications, right? So if you've set up the world, obviously this is a world in which there can be a computer that fuses a fly and a man, or else there's no story, right?
Yeah.
In the same sense that, you have a superhero story, you have to buy that such powers can exist. You have any sci-fi story, you've got to buy the premise. But it's important to follow through on that premise, to just sort of tease it out and see, all right, what would happen here? Not just that interests me much more than, hey, what if, government agents show up, and, what if somebody else uses the machine to fuse themselves with, a rhinoceros, okay. Just follow through on your implication. You can keep it a simple story, and you can make it heartbreaking and fascinating.
I totally agree, and I think that's why this film works so well. Is that saying it's asking you to sort of take a leap and to suspend your disbelief, but then is rewarding you with actually sort of going along on that journey. Because there's a lot of films these days that do. They'll ask you to suspend your disbelief and then be like, "Oh, you're here. Okay, let's just go," and just sort of we'll keep pushing the boundaries without actually trying to provide any reward. So yeah, I just think it is. It's a really well done piece of cinema. It's a real sort of it's a real demonstration of Cronenberg and why he is looked at in the way he is. And we will be coming back to Cronenberg, no doubt. So yeah, I say I've really enjoyed it. It's readily available. I got it off Amazon. But like I say, there's plenty of like DVD and Blu-ray versions of this knocking around, pretty cheap. So if you've never seen it, go give it a go.
And avoid The Fly 2, which I
Yes.
saw as a kid, and I don't remember anything of it. And apparently that does use some interview footage from the first one. Thank you, Wikipedia. So that's not the deleted scene that you were talking about, which is much more interesting.
Yeah, I think the thing with it, let's just sort of to bring it down, sort of like everything that we have commended The Fly for, being concise, following through on its ideas, being shocking, and all that sort of standing, still sort of standing the test of time. None of that is true for The Fly 2. It's yeah.
Which,
It's-
for the record, didn't have anybody involved in it. Didn't have Cronenberg, Goldblum, Gina Davis, John Getz.
No.
None of them. It was directed by the makeup guy from the first one.
Yeah, well, actually, no. John Getz is in it, but he is in it. He has a very small cameo at the very beginning. I can remember this. I quickly checked it. So, the prologue to I'll give you the prologue to The Fly 2 is a woman is giving birth to something. It's clearly not Gina Davis. I can't remember being Gina Davis. But John Getz is there, and he has a false hand, and he has a cane. So they're obviously following on from the fact that, but she gives birth, and the thing that is born is in a sack of something, and it does come out as a human child, but it kills her. So the birth actually kills her, and then this child is raised as part of Bartok's sort of in a Bartok lab, and he grows into Eric Stoltz, and it never gets any more interesting than that, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I remember watching it as a kid and thinking, I mean, what did it came out in like 89, I think?
Yes. Yeah.
So just 3 years later, and I remember thinking, like, wait a minute, that kid grew up. So we're in the future now, right? Where are my flying cars? Like clearly like 18 years passes or something. Which is very strange to have something set in the future that doesn't even acknowledge it. It's just like, well, there's no plot unless he grows up. So, okay.
And I think there could have been, they could have done more adventurous things. But yeah, don't bother with The Fly 2. It's not very good, and it doesn't try and explore any of its. It tries to lean into the horror rather than sort of science fiction themes or anything like that. And even the horror is not very good. It has one. I think it sort of has one sort of interesting idea at the end, and about sort of like corporate culture, but that's about it. But yeah, if we're ever sort of interested in going back and looking at terrible sequels, maybe we'll do it.
Maybe for a later season. When
we're really running
horrible
low.
movies. Horrible movies. I actually do sort of like that idea. I like horrible movies, but usually more fascinatingly horrible than The Fly 2.
Yes, and there are plenty of them in the sci-fi genre.
Oh man! So we're doing Akira next week.
Yes. So the next episode is Akira, the Japanese anime from 1988. I think we'll have to check that when we talk about it. But yes. So we're going again. This is the first time we're doing an animation. Japanese animation. It's got a fantastic sort of legacy. This film, it's one of the most, I would say, influential Japanese animes, heavily influenced by a film we talked about previously, Blade Runner. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking about this because for me it was the first anime film I ever saw, and I'm a big fan of the manga as well. So I'm looking forward to talking about that.
Yeah, well, it's very influential, as was The Fly. So
yes,
I hope everyone checks it out and check us out on Twitter too.
Yeah, we are on Twitter. We are. I'm going to pull it up so we can always remember. We are at Pod Time Space. Come and talk to us about The Fly or any of the other films that we've talked about in the past. Obviously we've got a full thing going on now with all these films we've talked about in the past, or any films you think we should pick up in the future. We've got a whole bunch already lined up, but if you want to throw others in, we'll happily consider them and we'll happily talk about them. One other thing before we go, just a little piece of admin. Someone I haven't mentioned really in the past episodes, and you'll see him mentioned in the show notes, but I just want to give a shout out to Wyatt Lane. He's the musician that did our intro and outro music for us. He has an album on SoundCloud and he's also on Spotify. So if you just go on there and look for Wyatt Lane, check out his music if you really like our intro and outro music. I think it's awesome. So thank you to Wyatt for doing that. But yeah, go check him out. He's also on Twitter. It's at Wyatt Lane. That's WYATTLAYNE. Okay, just thought it was worth giving him a shout out because
amen. I love that. I love that intro, and thank you, Wyatt.
Yeah, it's classic. It was something we sort of just spoke on Twitter, and I said, "Oh, do you want to try? Could you do this for us?" And he sort of yes, he pulled that together for us, and I think it's wonderful. So definitely check out his other music. But Julian, for this episode, thank you very much. It's been a fantastic discussion. And
thank you, Scott.
I've really enjoyed talking about Cronenberg. Yeah, it's been good.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, so next week next episode we're going to be getting into Japanese anime, which I think is going to be a different conversation once again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know both of us, like anime and love the idea of adult animation. So, it's important to address.
Yeah. So as I say, folks, before that, if you want to sort of jump in and speak to us, let us know. But for now, thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon.
There's something very important I forgot to tell you.
What?
Don't cross the streams.